Okay, let's start with some prayers tonight. Again, we've been reciting the Heart Sutra. I may not comment on too much of the Heart Sutra until maybe next week when we talk about the two truths in this line in the Heart Sutra where it says form is empty, emptiness is form. Anyway, I'll talk about that next week. But as we go through the recitation of this sutra, just try to make this a meditation on emptiness to the best of your ability. And we've been discussing this subject already, and some of you also have other teachings on this topic. So just bring that to mind as we kind of put ourselves back 2,500 years ago when the Buddha was teaching, and this gathering up on Vulture's Peak, right outside of Rajagriha. And kind of imagine being in the presence of the Buddha, Avalokiteshvara, Shariputra, as this sutra unfolds. Om, I prostrate to the Arya Triple Gem. Thus did I hear at one time, the Bhagawan was dwelling on massive Vulture's Mountain in Rajagriha, together with a great community of monks and a great community of bodhisattvas. At that time, the Bhagawan was absorbed in the concentration on the categories of phenomena called profound perception. Also at that time, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, Arya Avalokiteshvara, looked upon the very practice of the profound perfection of wisdom and beheld those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Then through the power of Buddha, the Venerable Shariputra said this to the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara: how should any son of the lineage train who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom? He said that, and the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara said this to the Venerable Sharadvatiputra: Shariputra, any son of the lineage or daughter of the lineage who wishes to practice the activity of the profound perfection of wisdom should look upon it like this, correctly and repeatedly, beholding those five aggregates also as empty of inherent nature. Form is empty. Emptiness is form. Emptiness is not other than form. Form is also not other than emptiness. In the same way, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, and consciousness are empty. Shariputra, likewise, all phenomena are emptiness, without characteristic, unproduced, unceased, stainless, not without stain, not deficient, not fulfilled. 1 second, let me move it up just a little bit. I gotta get the cursor in the right place. Shariputra, therefore in emptiness there is no form, no feeling, no discrimination, no compositional factors, no consciousness, no eye, no ear, no nose, no tongue, no body, no mind, no visual form, no sound, no odor, no taste, no object of touch, and no phenomenon. There is no I element, and so on, up to and including no mind element and no mental consciousness element. There is no ignorance, no extinction of ignorance, and so on, up to and including no aging and death, and no extinction of aging and death. Similarly, there is no suffering, origination, cessation, and path. There is no exalted wisdom, no attainment, and also no non-attainment. Shariputra, therefore, because there is no attainment, bodhisattvas rely on and dwell in the perfection of wisdom, the mind without obscuration and without fear. Having completely passed beyond error, they reach the end point of nirvana. All the Buddhas who dwell in the three times also manifestly completely awaken to unsurpassable, perfect, complete enlightenment in reliance on the perfection of wisdom. Therefore, the mantra of the perfection of wisdom, the mantra of great knowledge, the unsurpassed mantra, the mantra equal to the unequaled, the mantra that thoroughly pacifies all suffering, should be known as truth, since it is not false. The mantra of the perfection of wisdom is declared. Tayata Om Gate Gate paragate, parasamgate, bodhi swaha. Shariputra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva, should train in the profound perfection of wisdom like that. Then the Bhagawan arose from that concentration and commended the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, saying, well said, son of the lineage. It is like that. It is like that. One should practice the profound perfection of wisdom, just as you have indicated. Even the Tathagatas rejoice. The Bhagawan, having thus spoken, the Venerable Sharadvati Putra, the Bodhisattva Mahasattva Arya Avalokiteshvara, those surrounding in their entirety, along with the world of gods, humans, asuras, and Gandharvas, were overjoyed and highly praised that spoken by the Bhagawan. Let's do the short mandala offering. This ground, anointed with perfume, strewn with flowers, adorned with Mount Meru, 4 continents, the sun and the moon. I imagine this as a Buddha field and offer it. May all living beings enjoy this pure land. Idam Guru Ratna Mandalakam Niryatayami. And refuge in bodhicitta, first in English, and then 2 more times in the Tibetan. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By the merits I create through listening to the Dharma, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. Sangye chodang suki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chanyen gipe sonam gi drola penchir sangye druparsho. Sangye chodang soki choknam la jangchu bardu dakni kyapsu chi daki chanyan gipe sonam gi dola penchir sangye druparsho. Okay, let's do a short meditation. Give ourselves a chance to let go of whatever distractions we might have from our day by focusing on the breath for the first few minutes. Again, we talked about concentration a few sessions ago. But the goal is just to keep the mind as much as possible on the meditation object, which in this case is the breath, whichever way you prefer to work with the breath. Then when you see that the mind has wandered through the force of your introspection, then you restore your mindfulness of the breath, letting go of whatever it was that distracted you. So again, we'll do this in silence for just a few minutes, and then I'll come in and lead you in setting motivation for tonight. So now let's set our motivation together. To do this tonight, let's bring to mind dependent arising, this teaching that we looked at last week. A very kind of basic level of dependent arising is that things that are conditioned arise on the basis of their causes and conditions. They depend upon those for their existence. This is true of all phenomena that are produced. And this goal of enlightenment that we are directing our minds towards in setting our motivation is a produced phenomenon. It's something that arises from causes and conditions. And what we are doing here tonight, gathering together on Zoom or in here in the Gompa here physically, is about creating the causes for our eventual enlightenment and for the enlightenment of all beings. Because once we become a Buddha, then we can dedicate ourselves fully to the enlightenment of others and have all the perfect ability to do that. But this state of Buddhahood, our own future state of enlightenment, arises from its respective causes and conditions. And one of the main ones is the development of this mind of bodhicitta, the strong intention to become a Buddha, motivated by compassion and love for all beings with the wish to help them to be free from suffering, to find the happiness they seek. Remember that this is the method side of the path. This is where we generate that strong intention to benefit others and develop our skills to be able to do that. And then in this module, we're uniting that with the other element of the path, the second wing, the wing of wisdom, particularly the wisdom of emptiness, that will be the means by which we can remove all that obscures our minds currently and attain that perfect state of Buddhahood. These two need to be done in tandem together. We generate bodhicitta within the understanding of emptiness, and we cultivate emptiness and that realization of that within the realization of bodhicitta, within the mind that strives to become a Buddha for the sake of others. So try to bring those minds together right now in setting your motivation and understand them as a dependent arising. We're creating the causes and conditions through generating this mind of bodhicitta together with an understanding of emptiness as the means to eventually accomplish that goal, our own enlightenment, so we can then work perfectly for the welfare of all beings. You can open your eyes fully, and we'll begin. Okay, so in the last class, as I mentioned in the motivation, we went through the first of the two reasonings that we're going to use in this module. Understand that the Buddha taught a number of reasonings, and so this isn't the only way that we can go about realizing emptiness, but these two are the main ones, and they are the two that are taught by His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins in the wonderful book that I'm using for this module. I'm hoping that you're enjoying reading it. It's really, I think, quite nicely done. So I'll be using this as a source for a lot of tonight, because tonight we're going into the second reasoning, the reasoning of the 4-point analysis. This analysis particularly of the I, of the person that we identify with strongly, and kind of undermining that ignorance. So to begin, I would like to do a short review and even do a little exercise that I think might be interesting and might be insightful, who knows. Last week, again, we worked with the reasoning of dependent arising, so I would like to start with that topic as a brief review. We talked about the kind of courses level of dependent arising in the motivation tonight, that meditation I just led. And then also, of course, how we grasp at inherent existence. But recall that, just in summary, that there were 3 levels of dependent arising. The first being that coarser one of causes and conditions. And again, that's impermanent phenomena, produced phenomena, caused phenomena. Essentially, anything that arises through the force of other factors in that causal process is in that category. There are some phenomena that don't have causes per se in that way, things that they are produced from in a more substantial way, such as emptiness, for example. Emptiness does not arise from causes and conditions. It is a negation, a fact of everything lacking inherent existence. So that is not something that is an impermanent phenomenon. That's actually permanent, meaning it's unchanging momentarily. So anyway, this first level refers to all of those things, which is most of what we have in our world. All of these sense objects and our bodies, our minds, everything is causal phenomena in terms of those groupings. The second is dependence upon parts, the things that everything that exists, even emptiness, even other phenomena that are not produced, all depend upon parts, whether they be spatial parts, such as the book that I used last week as an example. It has various parts that are part of creating its physical composition, or temporal parts, meaning kind of moments in time, such as our consciousness that has moments of time and various factors within it. All of these are parts that the whole, the thing that we are talking about, depends upon. The interdependence of parts and whole is what's being referred to in this second level. The third one is dependence upon conceptuality, which is our imputation. Oh, that should say imputation, not immutation. Sorry, misspelled that somehow. Designation and labeling. Okay, so this is, again, the subtlest form of dependent arising, where we recognize that everything, there is a base for the phenomenon that is going to be imputed or designated, but it exists as a mere imputation. So again, when we used a book last time, we had the idea of the book being simply a label given to this collection of parts that is in my hand. We call that the basis of designation. The basis of designation and the designated object are actually two different phenomena, not inherently different or utterly different because they're interconnected. Book is the label we give to an object that satisfies the criteria that we've all decided is involved in establishing a book. And so that's the way that book exists in the end, is as mere imputation, mere designation. So tonight I'm going to use a little example that some of you may have seen before. Maybe I'll even switch my camera simply so that you can add spotlight to me. I don't know, does that work? I don't know if I'm on there or not. But anyway, I have a little object in my hand right now. Thank you, Shayla. I think you may have done that for me. Everyone see what this object is? And in the Gompa, it might be kind of far away, but you can see it on the screen, all right? So what is this object? Anyone? Clothespin. Okay, we call it a clothespin in English. I've used this in other countries, and they have different names for clothespins in different languages, of course. But this is what we come to identify as a clothespin, right? So when we talk about the causes and conditions, the dependence upon causes and conditions, we can see very clearly that there are two main parts that have their substantial causes. We have the wooden pegs of the clothespin that have wood, which of course arises from trees and all the various factors that produce trees and so on. And then we have the metal spring that is holding the two pegs together, right? And so essentially we have kind of the metal as being the main cause of the spring, and then we have the wood being the main cause of the pegs. But there are many other causes and conditions involved in this, right? Those are just the two substantial causes. Somebody designed a clothespin, many, many years ago. When I grew up, they weren't even clothespins like this with a spring. They were clothes pegs that you would put on the clothesline. And someone, a student at the center here years ago when I was using a clothespin, he shared with me a National Geographic issue that had a display of various clothespins. Apparently there was a Smithsonian exhibit about the history of the clothespin and the various things that have been designated as clothespins throughout time. So it's again, somebody came up with this idea, the original person that thought, wow, we need to put our clothes on a line and need something to hold them in place when the wind blows and what have you, so that they will dry and not fall to the ground and blow away or whatever. Okay, so there are many causes and conditions involved in this. in fact, we could say everything is involved in the creation of this. I think I mentioned that last week, right? When Carl Sagan said, if you want to bake an apple pie from scratch, you have to invent the universe. You have to go all the way back to all the causes and conditions. And of course, there were causes and conditions before the universe. So everything depends upon causes and conditions in terms of the physical world, but also, of course, our consciousness has its own substantial cause of prior moments of consciousness, as well as various other conditions that give rise to moments of consciousness. Let's go back to the clothespin. Second level, clothespin depends upon parts. Well, I just pointed out kind of three main parts, right? We have the two pegs, wooden pegs, and then we have the metal spring. So essentially we have those three parts, but every one of those parts has its own parts, right? In terms of the top of the one peg, the bottom, the sides, this little part here. And then of course, if you start going into molecular stuff and subatomic stuff and all the, quarks and subquarks and everything, you can find infinite parts to this clothespin. But we're going to just use three because it's a very convenient way of working with this with three. Let's kind of take this apart and see what happens in terms of establishing that we have these three parts that contribute to a clothespin, all right? So we have two wooden pegs, and then we have the little spring. So let's take a look at this kind of getting to this third level of the fact that there's no real clothespin from the side of these objects that are the basis of designation for clothespin. Rather, clothespin is coming from our minds. So if I hold this one up, again, to the camera there, everyone can see this is the little metal spring. Is there a clothespin there? No. We might think of it as a part of a clothespin. If we saw it and we go, oh, I think that's part of a clothespin, isolated from the pegs or whatever. We might still think of that, but it has no clothespinness. If you went to the store and you bought a bag full of these, thinking you were buying clothespins, you'd be very disappointed when you got home, right? You can't really do anything with these in terms of putting your clothes up on the line. The first of the pegs, is that a clothespin? No, I mean, again, we see it through our training and conditioning as part of a clothespin. And the person who works in the factory where these are made probably sees more of these than any of us and is probably sick of looking at these parts of a clothespin. But it isn't a clothespin. Again, if you went to the store and you bought a bag of these, you'd also be very disappointed because your criteria for what is a clothespin is not being met by this. Clothespin is not what's in my hand, right? And the other one, of course, would be the same because they are kind of identical. They're just two clothespins pegs that were being put together, but neither of them is a clothespin, right? So if I go, and this isn't too hard to do, I think with the one I have here, when I was teaching in Florida, I had to use someone else's clothespin because I forgot mine at home. And theirs was very, very tight. And this one I've gotten kind of loosened up by doing this. Okay, so now I've taken those three pieces. Is there a clothespin in my hand now? Well, it appears to be kind of a real clothespin. It fits our conventional designation as clothespin. It's now put together in the proper way where it can serve the function of hanging on a clothesline, keeping our clothes in place. But there was no clothespin in any of these parts. So where did clothespin come from? Well, you might think it came from assembling the three parts, but I didn't add anything, right? I didn't have like the two pegs and the spring and then a fourth part that's clothespin, right? So where did clothespin come from in the end, even after assembling it?
Designation?
It's got to, yes, very good, Benjamin. Yes, designation. It's coming from our minds. We are designating this as clothespin. There's no real clothespin on any of the parts because, again, we couldn't find clothespin on any of the parts. Even when it's assembled, we'd have a hard time finding an inherently existent clothespin here established in what's in my hand. Because, again, we have three parts to it. So we're going to see this when we get into the analysis today. You would essentially have three clothespins here at least because you have three parts to it. But instead, we have a unitary phenomenon here that seems to be clothespin appearing that way as this unitary self-established phenomenon. In the end, as we just did in picking this all apart, putting it back together, there's no clothespin that exists out here. Clothespin is a label that we're giving to this. Now, another way of kind of thinking about this, which I didn't mention last week, is that if I had a dog in the room who likes to chew, one of the students up in Taos, I stay with them sometimes, and they've got Labrador retrievers, that just love to chew stuff. I mean, this dog, it's unbelievable what it does to these plastic bones. But if I threw this across the room to this black Labrador up there and it went running to get it, it might have fun chewing on this for a while until it got to the metal part, and then I don't think it would have too much fun. But the wooden parts of it, it would probably dig its teeth into and enjoy it for a while. Does the dog know that he's chewing on a clothespin? No, right? The dog just sees it as a chew toy or something to entertain them for a while by giving them something to sink their teeth into. Again, we don't know a dog's kind of inner thinking, the thoughts that it's having, but it's definitely not having the thought, oh, I think I'll chew on this clothespin. The dog is simply seeing it as a chew toy. There's no clothespin from the side of the object. The object doesn't have that at all. It's how we are designating it as a clothespin, and then the black Labrador would see it as a chew toy, right? Whatever their conceptual image of that is, because that's what they're familiar with. That's what they are relating to their world. Remember, I mentioned this a few sessions ago, how like kind of we're organizing our world in a particular way. And we have to organize our world. We wouldn't be able to communicate with each other and function in the world doing the things that we need to do, right? We have kind of put those labels, designations on all of this to organize the world. But then the world seems to be designated from its own side, seems to have its own identity established out there. But it doesn't. Again, because different beings relate to different things differently. So if it was clothespin from its own side, the dog would know it as clothespin. I wouldn't even have to learn the label for clothespin. Somebody would have just shown this to me when I was 5 years old or something, and I would have said, oh, clothespin. It's got some inherent identity as clothespin. This is what we do in everything in our world, right? We learn what things are. We learn how to relate to them, how to organize them again, so that we have some sense to the world that we live in. But it isn't organized that way from its own side. It's merely designated by our consciousness. So again, this is kind of the underpinning for everything we're going to talk about tonight in getting into this analysis. It's more about driving towards realizing emptiness. Dependent arising helps us to realize emptiness, but it's also a very sound way, as I mentioned last week, of establishing how things actually exist, so that we have a foundation of understanding that everything is merely designated. Emptiness is merely designated. Designated to what? To the quality of lacking inherent existence. Everything is merely imputed by our minds. There are bases for these things. I'm not saying that it's purely mental, that there's nothing that exists physically or whatever. The basis for a clothespin is what I'm holding in my hand, but it has no clothespinness, if I can use that word, from its own side. The clothespin identity is given to it through the force of our conceptual minds, our imputational minds, and so on. All right, let me go through one more thing on the that I went through last week, just real briefly. This second topic that I wanted to review is how we grasp at inherent existence. Again, recall that this was from the reading that you had for last week, which was from Virtue and Reality by Rinpoche. The basis of the object appears, and that is labeled as that object. So again, at some point, what I again was holding up as a for you to identify as clothespin, we had that held up to us at some point. Maybe when I was 5, 4, I don't know when I learned what a clothespin was. I don't remember. But my mother or father or somebody showed me this object and go, oh, it's a clothespin. As soon as I learned the label for that object, the first step is done. And if I stopped there, again, as I said last week, that would be the best thing, only to get that it's merely labeled as a clothespin. But through the force of our having misconceived the clothespin as inherently existent, we then have the second step happening, which is the object then appears to exist from its own side. So again, when this appears to you, and you already know the label because you already went through the first step a long time ago. But even when it reappears to you, you go, oh, Don's holding a clothespin. But it seems to have the identity out here on its own, self-established, seems to be from the side of this object, as opposed to what is really going on, which was in the first step, a mere designation, a mere imputation of the label clothespin to this base. Then the third step, I won't go back to the slides, but the third step is we believe in that. We buy into that. And therefore, we further our ignorance, which then creates the imprints, so things continue to appear as if they were real in that way. We're caught up in this cycle that we've been involved in since beginningless time. And this is how we get in trouble, is because we keep believing in what appears to us. That's why this is particularly difficult to realize, in my estimation, is because this is the stuff that we swim in. This is the stuff that we're involved in. Everything in our world is appearing as if it's real. And as I said last week, most people don't even question it. They don't go into any sort of, that's where some people talk about how in quantum physics, there's kind of things that drive to maybe some things that touch on the importance of the subjective awareness and establishing objective reality. But unless you go to the questioning of whether things have an inherent identity, on the basis of those sorts of investigations that happen in quantum physics, you don't actually get to that place of saying, maybe things don't exist in the way they appear, right? Maybe they're not as real as what I think they are. So let me see if there are any questions on these ideas before we move on, because I don't want to, I want to make sure that we're all kind of on the same page, that we've gotten the import of what I talked about last week. Anyone? I hope you had a chance to read that section of His Holiness's book if you didn't for last week's class, because I really like that he presents that at the beginning. As I mentioned last week, Venerable Tipton Chodron is a student of His Holiness and a wonderful teacher herself. And she always encourages people to start with the reasoning of dependent arising if we're working with people who are new to this concept of emptiness. And so His Holiness very skillfully started with that topic to make sure that we kind of understand how things exist. Remember, we're trying to avoid these two extremes. Right now, we are in the extreme of thinking everything is real, existing in a kind of eternalistic way from its own side. That's the one extreme we need to pull away from. But sometimes we pull too far and we fall into the nihilistic extreme, where we think things don't exist at all. Well, if things are dependent arisings, they exist, they arise, they come into existence. They just do so in a dependent manner, not an independent, concrete, self-established manner. So this is what we're going to be pursuing tonight in terms of this continuing with an investigation that His Holiness lays out as kind of the next main one, which is again called the 4-point analysis. Now, to get into the 4-point analysis, His Holiness has a few topics that I do want to touch on, because we're going to use this primarily as an analysis of the I, again, the person, the self that we identify with. So let's first talk about this idea of why we start there. What's the importance of starting there? His Holiness says, I'm doing a bit of sharing tonight on the screen because this is such a rich section that I want to make sure that I use some of His Holiness's words and then comment on them. Since it is the individual person who undergoes pleasure and pain, makes trouble and accumulates karma, all the noise and the mess being made by the self, analysis should begin with yourself. So remember that when we talked about that tree of samsara, that is our own individual experience. Of course, we're involved in the samsaric experiences of other beings, but we're talking about our own individual tree. That is us developing our own karma on the basis of our own mental states that then results in our own experiences of suffering, pleasure, and so on. All of that is our own kind of personal cyclic existence, our own way of existing in this world, conditioned by these factors that are keeping us from realizing our true potential. So again, this is the starting point for this, is to recognize that this is what is behind the whole mechanism, is the individual person and the misconceptions around that. So he says, then when you understand that this person is without inherent existence, which of course our belief in inherent existence is what's causing us to engage in all that trouble, you can extend this realization to the things that you enjoy, undergo, and make use of. In this sense, the person is principle. So we often talk about kind of the person and the objects of use by that person. And essentially, these are the two main categories that we're going to be talking about in terms of how selflessness can be established. But we always start with the person or the I because this is the instrument by which we get involved in all these objects in our world. You know? Clothespins, again, we use a clothespin, but a clothespin is generally not a huge object of attachment for us, right? I mean, I sometimes, now that I've got this one clothespin that I like to travel with, of course, I get a little unnerved when I can't find it, right? But that's hopefully not attachment. It's just making sure I have my props. But the reality is that we can have attachment to an awful lot of objects or aversion to an awful lot of objects. And that's the mechanism, as I explained earlier, by which we get into trouble. We start developing these negative mind states, attachment, aversion, anger, jealousy, greed, what have you. And then we go on to create karma on the basis of that. And that causes us to have suffering, unpleasant experiences. And even when we have wholesome states of mind, they're still grounded in ignorance, though they're more positive states of mind that bring about virtuous karma that cause us to have more favorable experiences, experiences of happiness and so on. They're still caught up in the same delusion, the root delusion of ignorance, holding those things to be real, revolving around a personal identity that is relating to objects in various ways, healthy ways, unhealthy ways, what have you. So we really see that the person is at the root of all of this. So let's continue on with what His Holiness says. Whoops. When you know well how the I really is, you can understand all internal and external phenomena using the same reasoning. This is the whole thing about saying all things are empty of inherent existence. We're not changing what we're negating or, kind of the fundamental truth about things when we work with an I versus everything that's not an I. It's this exact same thing that we're trying to get at, the exact same object of negation, as we're going to call it tonight. Then His Holiness continues, he says, seeing how one phenomenon, yourself, exists, you can also know the nature of all other phenomena. And again, we get involved in the I primarily because it's the main instigator. So he says, then this is why the procedure for meditation is first to strive to generate realization of your own lack of inherent existence, and then to work at realizing the same with respect to other phenomena. We're going to come back around to this towards the end of tonight when we look at this is the test as to whether we've really hit home with our analysis. Because if we apply the same understanding to another object that is not the I, we should come to the same conclusion. So this gets into the categorization, and I'm just going through this because it is important to have this terminology, what we call the two types of selflessness. Selflessness in this context is a equivalent to emptiness. So it's two types of emptiness, but we're talking about refuting a self of persons, which in primarily the one we're going to work with is ourselves, the I that we identify with, and of course the other beings, because they are also persons. So we're going to talk about that as a separate category because, again, that's where we start. That's what we begin to focus on. So we can realize the emptiness of this I that is running the whole show. Then the second one is selflessness of phenomena. Now, a person is a phenomenon. So it would be included in that if we just use the term phenomena. Phenomena includes everything that exists. But in this context, selflessness of phenomena means any phenomena that are other than persons. Okay. So the traditional one is, of course, that you look at the I, analyze the I first, but then you can begin to look at what are again called the aggregates. I talked about these last week. The aggregates are, if you take the 5 that the Buddha taught, the 4 of them are mental, and the first one is physical. That's form. Remember in the Heart Sutra that we just recited, we started with form and analyzing form because it's form, feeling, discrimination, compositional factors, consciousness. Form is our bodies. So we have our bodies and we have our minds, these other 4 aggregates. So essentially, these are what compose a person. They are phenomena other than the person. So often you start with the I and analyzing the I, and then you apply that same analysis to the body or to the mind or to phenomena that are outside of our continuum, such as, things we're attached to or things we have aversion towards and so on. But it's realizing the emptiness, the selflessness of every one of those things in the similar way. But we start with the I, again, because of the centrality in terms of our experience in samsara. Okay, let's go on just a few more slides on this topic before we move on. So His Holiness makes this really clear in terms of this term selflessness, because I think it can be a little confusing. In Buddhism, the term self has two meanings that must be differentiated in order to avoid confusion. One meaning of self that we often use is person or living being, right? We're going to analyze the self. Well, the self here is the person that we're identifying as, or other people. It says here on the screen, this is the being who loves and hates, who performs actions and accumulates good and bad karma, who experiences the fruits of those actions, who is reborn in cyclic existence, who cultivates spiritual paths, and so on. And then, at the level of looking at it as a dependent arising, that self exists, right? That self is a being that depends upon, or a phenomenon that depends upon its causes and conditions. It depends upon its parts, and it depends upon imputation. Because again, we take the five aggregates and we are imputing a self, a person on that. So, this first level of understanding what a self can be in terms of Buddhist terminology is simply the self that is designated to this collection of stuff, again, that we call the five aggregates or the mind and body complex, another term for that. So, essentially, this is, again, a perfectly fine conventional terminology that we can use. And once more, that self exists. Well, what are we saying is selfless then when we talk about selflessness? That's where His Holiness goes. He says, the other meaning of self occurs in the term selflessness, where it refers to a falsely imagined, over concretized status of existence, once more, that we call inherent existence. And remember, I went through a number of the terms that His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins use in their book to refer to that. Existing from its own side, existing by way of its own nature, its own characteristics, blah, 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 blah. And there were, I think, in Meditation on Emptiness by Jeffrey Hopkins, there are something like 17 different hypothetical synonyms. They're called hypothetical because it doesn't even exist. So we can't say it's a real synonym. But inherent existence is this sense of an independent, concrete, self-established phenomenon, whatever it is that we're referring to. His Holiness continues, he says, the ignorance that adheres to such an exaggeration is indeed the source of ruination, the mother of all wrong attitudes. Perhaps we could even say it's devilish. It's like a demon. In fact, in the mind training teachings in Module 11 of Discovering Buddhism, you may have touched on this idea of the twin demons. The root demon, the real problem is this mind that's grasping at a self that doesn't exist, a self of phenomena, a self of persons that is exaggerated, that has this additional status that is not there at all, of having some intrinsic, inherent, independent existence. This is a demonic mind. The other demon, of course, that you looked at when you were doing Module 11 was the main one that is a target of, which is self-cherishing, the tendency to elevate that sense of self to a higher level than what we care about in regard to others. So we often neglect the needs of others and care about ourselves more. That's a more operative way that we are working with that ignorance. That ignorance is at the root of all of our problems. Again, it's the roots in that tree of samsara. So when we talk about selflessness there, we are talking about a self that doesn't exist that we need to negate. That's what we're going to look at tonight in terms of this reasoning, is to really get at that sense of self and make sure that we kind of, using that as the target, that we demolish it through our reasoning, through our analysis. And I have to admit, when I came to Buddhism, at least when I came to these teachings on emptiness, because I actually found Buddhism a couple of years before that, but no one was teaching me on emptiness initially in the other tradition that I started with. And when I came to an FPMT center in San Francisco and they started talking about emptiness, I was like, wow, that's that's pretty amazing. I mean, like, can you just get it really what the Buddha is saying? That what the root problem is that we are misconceiving and misbelieving in a world that again is appearing to us to exist in this way, and that doesn't exist that way at all. This is the self that we're trying to negate. It's all around us. It's in most of our thoughts. There was a little section in the book that I didn't touch on where Lama Tsongkhapa says that you can have essentially three different ways that you're conceiving of things. You do have moments where perhaps you're just thinking of things very conventionally and you're not grasping at them as inherently existent. That can happen. That's one way. Another way is where you actually come to see them as empty of inherent existence. That's what we're striving for in these reasonings, is to kind of get to the place where we go, that thing doesn't lack, that thing doesn't have inherent existence. It lacks that way of existing. We want to get to that in regard to the person as well as with regard to all phenomena. But a third one is kind of understanding then that sort of conventional way that things exist, which you really can't do without having seen their emptiness, which is that they are merely imputed, that they are merely designated. And we can say it, but we're not really going to understand it until we get to a deeper realization of emptiness, when we get the really subtle way that things exist. So again, you're not clinging to inherent existence there either, but that's a very different way of understanding things, right? So again, those two there of kind of seeing them as empty of inherent existence in the conventional way, that's a deeper way. The way that we fall into more generally is adhering to them as real. And that's, again, our default mode most of the time. We have moments when we aren't clinging to things as inherently existent, but those are only moments, and we're not really doing it through an antidote, through understanding how things actually exist. We're simply having these little gaps in our awareness where we're not clinging so tightly to things. Generally, our default mode is we're always grasping. I say always, but again, as I just explained, it's not all the time, but it's most of the time. Enough of the time to keep getting us in trouble again and again. So again, this is what we're trying to negate, is this false sense of self, the way that the mind operates when it kind of grasps at things through our habitual ignorance that we've had since beginningless time. So let's go back to the slides. There's just, I don't know if there's much more to finish up on this topic, but we go on to another one. In observing the I that depends upon mental and physical attributes, this mind exaggerates the I into being inherently existent, despite the fact that the mental and physical elements being observed do not contain any such exaggerated being. Again, because it's appearing to exist in that way, but it doesn't have that mode of existing at all. And this is what our analysis is also to help us to get at, to understand that how things appear and how they actually exist are not in accord. They're not lined up. They're in contradiction to each other. This is the reason why the I and all other phenomena are described in Buddhism as name only, meaning that they have mere designation, mere imputation. Don't think name here means only linguistic, because I talked about that last week in regard to that subtlest level of dependent arising that we touched on earlier. We do use our language to give names to things such as clothespin and eye and computer and chair and all the various things in our world. And that language is a key part of our clinging to things, but it's not the only way that we know things. We know them through a mental designation that eventually does have linguistic components to it, because that's how we communicate with each other. So continuing, he says, the meaning of this is not that the I and all other phenomena are just words, since the words for these phenomena do indeed refer to actual objects or even the concepts about things. There's something that is always being referred to. When I say clothespin, right? Well, clothespin refers to this little guy that I got in my hand here, right? This collection of stuff that we're going to call clothespin. So it's not that clothespin is only a name, because then it would just be over here as a name. I'm just clothespin, clothespin, clothespin. But what's the basis for clothespin? There's always a basis for everything that exists. Even emptiness, again, has a basis. As I said earlier, the basis for the term, concept, the name emptiness is the lack of inherent existence of a phenomenon. So let's carry on with what His Holiness says, because he's saying, don't think that because things are having this pure subjective existence, no objective existence, that there's nothing that is beyond that name. The name is always referring to a basis. Rather, these phenomena do not exist in and of themselves. The term name only eliminates the possibility that they are established from the object's own side. Again, that there's objective existence. Name only means there's subjective existence. The subjective awareness that is knowing that phenomenon is giving it its status as an existent. We need this reminder because the I and other phenomena do not appear to be merely set up by name and thought. And quite the contrary. As I've already demonstrated, and I don't need to say much more about that, things appear to exist from their own side objectively. And things don't exist that way at all. And that's what we're about in this analysis tonight. How can you understand that this perspective is mistaken? Focus on the fact that there's nothing within mind and body that can be I. Mind and body are empty of a tangible I. Rather, just as a car is set up in dependence upon its parts and is not even the sum of its parts, so the I depends upon mind and body. Again, what we're touching on here, what His Holiness is very skillfully going back to, is that subtlest way of dependent arising. Everything in the end doesn't have any inherent existence. It's merely designated, merely imputed, depending upon a basis. In this case, I depending upon mind and body. Car depending upon the parts of the car. An I without depending on mind and body does not exist, right? Where is the I that is not depending upon a mind and a body? Or some factors of those. And there's the formless realm where they only have very subtle wind energy. They don't really have a body, a quartz body like we have. But there's always something that is the basis of the I. And then the next part, whereas an I that is understood to be dependent upon mind and body exists in accordance with the conventions of the world. Things still do exist. Clothespins, I, tables, chairs, whatever, all these phenomena exist, but in accordance with the conventions of the world, where we simply are designating, organizing our world in a particular way, with certain language, with certain concepts, definitions. So understanding that this type of I that is not at all to be found within mind and body, and is not even the sum of mind and body, but exists only through the power of its name and our thoughts, is helpful as we strive to see ourselves as we really are. So again, he kind of brings it back around to that same idea of seeing the dependent arising of the I in the various, the really subtle way, the very subtle way, where it is arising merely as a label given to mind and body. And you don't have an I that exists independent of the mind and the body. The I depends upon the mind and body as its basis in order to be designated. That's the way the I exists. That's the only way the I exists. And it's so slight. I love this one quote from Lama Zopa Rinpoche. He was teaching, I've heard this from him a couple of times, where he said, it's almost as if the I doesn't exist. I mean, this is something that, again, as I mentioned earlier, to really get to that subtle way of understanding how the I actually exists in mere name, in mere designation, you almost have to have a realization of emptiness to come back around and get that fully, to really get the import of that. But I think we can all generate some taste for it. Hopefully, what I explained last week in your reading of His Holiness's book, as well as meditating on that meditation from Venerable Rabina about seeing the dependent arising of the body, that hopefully you've got a taste for it and you can begin to see that things don't stand on their own. They don't have that independent existence. They exist as dependent arisings. And having that underpinning and that's kind of as our basis to go into the analysis that we're going to look at tonight is really critical, because we're never negating that things exist at all. We're only negating that they exist in a fictitious way, that they appear to exist, and again, that we adhere to them existing. That is what we're negating. That fictitious self, again, that was pointed out earlier, this self that we are exaggerating through the force of our ignorance. We believe in that 100%. We have since beginningless time, and we have to undermine the belief in that. So I think we're going to take a short break now, because even though it's a few minutes before 8, so we haven't gone quite an hour, I'm going to get into another topic, and I think it'll be better if we, because the next topic is the 3 misconceptions of the I, and this is not a huge topic, but I do want to talk about this a little, because now that we are understanding that this is the main thing we're going to investigate, it's important to know the different ways that the Buddha taught that the I lacks certain types of self. The one that is the main target that, again, we're looking at in this course is the inherently existent self, or I. But there are other ones that are kind of precursors to that. That's also important, for us to touch on in a brief way. I'm not going to go into deep teachings on it, but we'll spend a little time on that. So let's take 5 minutes. I think my clock on my computer here just turned to 7:59. So let's about 4 minutes after, 5 minutes. All right, let's carry on. All right, well, let me see if there's questions first. I don't like talking for too long, and then if there are questions, and I kind of get forgotten somehow. So anyone have any questions on anything I've talked about so far tonight? And a lot of this is a precursor to what we're going to look at in this 4-point analysis, and it'll get even clearer, hopefully, by going through that. Let me just talk a little bit about these kind of 3 types of self that we are falsely imputing in regard to the I. As we just talked about before this break, we are starting with the analysis of the person, the I, that is in our own continuum, that is the strong identity, the sense of identity that we have with regard to this collection of stuff. The one that we're targeting, of course, is the subtlest one. And often in Buddhism, you go through kind of an initial exposure to this by looking at the coarser versions of an I that we are grasping at. So I want to share these with you because I think there's some benefit and value to having some exposure to them. I don't think we'll go through a formal kind of refutation of these, but we will talk about how they can be refuted in a coarse way. The first one is the initial teaching that the Buddha gave, and we can say that anyone who is Buddhist at least believes in this level of selflessness, because there are different tenet systems, philosophical systems that teach various views of all of this. The one that we're looking at again is the Prasangika Madhyamaka, the consequence middle way school. It says all 3 of these don't exist. But most of the schools of Buddhism actually would only say that the first 2 don't exist. They wouldn't go as far as the third one, which is unique to this view. But this first one is often referred to as refuting what was called in the Vedic traditions an Atman, Atman. This is often translated as a soul. But this is something that, as the footnote says, you acquire intellectually through being exposed to various misconceptions. It's not innate, meaning that we carry it from life to life, which is what Lama Tsongkhapa says we do with regard to numbers 2 and 3. But rather, it is acquired through false tenets and various ways that we have of kind of reifying the self in regard to there being a sort of soul. I grew up Catholic, and so I don't know if it's exactly equivalent to the concept of soul that I was taught in terms of having an immortal soul. That kind of was the essence of who I was. But I never really understood where that immortal soul was or what is the basis for it. And this is described in the Vedic tradition when we're kind of observing that type of self as a permanent, meaning that it's unchanging, partless, meaning it has a unitary nature. You can't find parts to it, which is kind of strange. And then also independent. By independent here, we mean that it has some independent status of causes and conditions, of the the body and mind. It has to have this kind of sense of it being completely independent. But when I look at what I was taught in terms of Christianity and Roman Catholicism and my understanding of a soul, was that I never really got into that language in Catholicism, but there was this thing that I'm identifying with, this body and mind. But then there's this immortal soul that is something that is completely independent, that wouldn't be kind of together with his body and mind. That's what goes on to experience eternal damnation in hell or eternal salvation in heaven with God and Jesus and whoever. I mean, I'm not making light of that idea. What I'm saying is that I think it's somewhat similar in terms of identifying something that is completely independent of the body and mind, that has its own status, that is a sort of unchanging essence of who we are, a unitary phenomenon. Again, the Buddha didn't have a real difficulty in refuting this. I mean, in his estimation, what is the basis for that? Where do you find it? What is it that you can point to as existing as that Atman? Again, he's not trying to completely dismiss other traditions, such as the Vedic tradition that existed at the time of the Buddha, but rather from a Buddhist perspective in terms of what we are trying to do, which is to analyze, to use our thinking mind, our contemplating mind, to see whether these things exist in reality or not. And essentially, for this one, this is something that, again, can there be something that is completely independent of the body and the mind, that is who you are? Well, we don't have a sense of that even, right? I don't have a sense that there's some other thing here that is me, that is completely independent of the body and the mind. I feel the sense of I very much connected with the body and the mind, right? So this, again, isn't too difficult to refute, but it's the coarsest view of an I that the Buddha taught that we may have inherited. We may have gotten that through various teachings we were exposed to. The second one has a rather long name, but I'm going to try to give it as brief a description as I can so that you kind of get the import of that one. Because again, Tsongkhapa says that this is innate. This is one that we actually do have operating in our minds at times. It's called here a self-sufficient, substantially existent I. Now, to get into explaining all of these words, you'd really have to do a lot more kind of investigation of what these schools mean by imputed existent and substantially existent. Instead, I'm going to talk about it in a real general way because, again, this is discovering Buddhism. This isn't like, your deep investigation into these tenet systems. This is really just to give us a flavor for the different ways that we can misconceive the I. The one, again, is that Atman, that soul, that it seems to be totally apart and independent. This one seems to be kind of here among the aggregates, kind of hanging out with them. In fact, Jeffrey Hopkins has a very colorful way of describing what this is like. He says, this is like if you have a sales department and you have a head salesperson. Maybe some of you have worked in sales or something where you have that, right? Everyone's in the same department, right? That department is the department of this person. And you have this chief one, this main one, that is kind of telling the other ones what to do, kind of in charge, in control. We often have that kind of sense of a self, right? And we even refer to the mind and the body that are like the other salespeople. We're like the head salesperson that kind of is directing what the mind and the body do. And it has a sense of a self that seems to be in charge, that's in control. His Holiness, in one of his teachings, he talks about how we can see some evidence of this in terms of how we even think about the body and the mind from the perspective of an I that seems to be there in charge. He says, let me actually read it. It's from this book called The Middle Way, which is a commentary on some of Nagarjuna's verses from his fundamental wisdom text that I mentioned way back in the first class. But he says here, say an old person whose body is deteriorating and is full of aches is given the opportunity to exchange his body for another much healthier body, like get a teenage body, a body that has more vitality and flexibility and what have you. From the depths of his mind would emerge a ready willingness to take part in such an exchange. This suggests that deep down, we believe in a self that is distinct from our body, yet is somehow master over it. right? We go, yeah, I'll take that body and I'll exchange it for the body I have so I can have this new body, right? We think that there's some I that's in charge of all that. He says, similarly, if a person with a poor memory or some other mental deficiency were given an opportunity to exchange his or her mind for a fresh one with superior cognitive powers, again, from the depth of the heart would arise a real willingness to enter into the transaction, right? I'll take that new mind. Thank you very much. Well, who is the I that is taking that new mind and discarding the old one, or taking the new body and discarding the old one? He says this suggests that not only in relation to our body, but also in relation to our mental faculties, we believe in a self who would benefit from such an exchange, a self that is somehow the ruler or master of the body and mind. This is from this book called The Middle Way. Again, some commentary that His Holiness gave on Nagarjuna's verses. That's the sense of I that we all do have to some degree. Now, why I'm introducing it is because that too needs to be refuted by identifying that there's no kind of I that's hanging out here with the mind and the body. Like you don't have six aggregates, the four mental and the form, and then the sixth one that's an I that's kind of together with them, that's in charge of them. Where is that person that is kind of in charge? Again, the Buddha thought this was also important to refute because sometimes we operate from that vantage point of the I that's in control of this whole collection of stuff. Now, what's the difference between that and the third level, the inherently existent I? The inherently existent I is where we identify that there's something here, could be the same as, could be different than the aggregates, that is a real I, that has, again, its own mode of establishing itself, that has its own reality. It's different than this sense of a controller. It's a level of reality that we are adhering to, not necessarily involved in particular roles, but involved in its very existence. It exists in a real, concrete way. And what's interesting about all the other tenet systems that I was mentioning, that they say those first two don't exist, but this third one, they will say, no, there's no way that you can refute an inherently existent I, because there has to be something here that is the I, that is the real I. They might refute those other ones, but they still think there's a real I here together with this stuff. Where is that real I? For many of them, they might point to one of the things that's a basis of an I, such as the mind or the continuity of the mind. And they'll say, that's the real I. That's what we're trying to refute, is anything that is more than being merely imputed, having any level of reality that is self-established, that is able to be found because of that. And that's the whole basis for this analysis we're going to go into, is that if the real I existed in this collection of stuff, that third level of I that only this school that we're studying refutes, this middle way view, if that really exists, then we should be able to point to it. We should be able to find something that is it. Just like conventionally, if you go into the drawer where you keep your keys, maybe you just throw your keys in there when you come back, or the dish or whatever, you should be able to find them. You should be able to say, there are my keys. Well, we have a belief in the reality of this I that we should be able to, in deeper investigation, say, where is that real I? We need to, again, make sure we're not refuting something that's coarser, though. We want to get to the subtlest level of the way that that I appears, the way that we grasp at it. And on the basis of that, we can refute this false sense of an I. So this is the third level. Let me put that back on the screen from the slides. The first one is the coarsest one, and some people may not have that. I mean, like if I thought about it, I was introduced to the concept of a soul through my Catholic upbringing. Would I have gotten it without someone telling me that there was a soul? Do you have an innate belief that you have a soul? I don't think so. I mean, I think you have to kind of get indoctrinated into that concept. Then you start thinking, oh, that's who I really am. I'm that soul or Atman or whatever that is completely independent of my body and mind. The self-sufficient, substantially existent one, again, is the one that's the controller, the master, the boss. And that one we have quite innately. But this deeper one, we need to make sure that we are refuting what this looks like. And this is the target that we're going to see in regard to this 4-point analysis. All right, let's go into it. I'm going to use kind of the introductory stuff that His Holiness does. It's very brief, and then talk a little bit about it and even go to the meditation that you have, because there's one way of doing this meditation that is in the one that you've been given to work with, but there's also kind of looking at the consequences, and I'll explain that in a moment. This is what His Holiness calls this 4 steps to realization. In the traditional way that we talk about it is the 4-point analysis. The first step is to identify the ignorant beliefs that must be refuted. You need to do this because when you perform analysis seeking yourself within the mind and body or separate from the mind and body, and you do not find it, you could wrongly conclude that you utterly do not exist. So Lama Zopa Rinpoche, in some of his teachings, he would really make it clear that just, we've done the kind of understanding of dependent arising prior to this. You're not looking for the merely imputed I, because you won't find that either, right? What does it mean to be merely imputed? It means merely designated, that I is a label given to this collection of stuff. Well, you can't go looking for that, because that's not the misconception we have either. But the idea is that you will not find that, and on the basis of that, you could fall into a nihilistic view. Think, wow, that doesn't even exist in reality. Well, it's not meant to exist in reality in terms of being findable, because a merely imputed I is just that. It's merely designated. What you are trying to refute, what the target is this inherently existent I, this I that seems to exist from its own side, that appears to have its own identity, that appears to be self-established. And we, by virtue of kind of bringing that to mind, we then are going to go look for that and see if it really exists in the way that it appears. They often compare this first step, and even the rest of the analysis to some degree, but this first step is like if you're in a very large crowd. I mean, many of us have been to concerts or gatherings, fairs, things like that, where there are a lot of people around. And imagine that suddenly you reach down and you realize that your purse, your wallet, whatever, something that's very valuable to you, that it's not there. And you had it just a few minutes ago, and it's not there. And then that someone has taken it. There's a thief in the crowd. Someone has pickpocketed you and taken, your valuable cards and what have you, all the things that you carry with you. If you don't know what the thief looks like, you're not going to get very far in identifying them and being able to retrieve this, right? So this first step is identifying the thief, identifying that false sense of an I, because again, the main target we're going to use here has to do with this sense of I that we are adhering to, that's at the root of all of our problems. We want to be able to identify the thief correctly. If you were able to find out from the people around you in that scenario where you're out in a crowd, well, did you see who was standing right next to me? I thought and they say, oh yeah, it was he, she, whatever, looked like this, da 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 da. They were wearing this type of clothes, blah blah blah. Well, once you have kind of a good idea of who you're looking for, then it's a lot easier, right? They say this first step is absolutely crucial. If you don't identify the I, that is the false sense of I that you're adhering to correctly, again, you could be refuting not enough. Again, maybe you're refuting that coarser view of an I. That's not going to get you to the target of this middle way view. Or you're refuting too much, and you're refuting that the I exists at all. It does exist. It exists in a very subtle way, as we saw with the reasoning of dependent arising. But you don't want to refute that. You want to refute this inherent existence, this false way that, again, things appear to be existing and that we grasp at, we believe in. I'm going to share a little bit more on that later when we get into this in more detail. The second step. Oh, wait, I'm sorry, there's a little bit more to this. Sorry, I don't remember all the slides that I put in here. His Holiness says then on this first step, because the I appears to our minds to be established in and of itself, when we use analysis to try to find it and it is not found, it seems that the I does not exist at all, whereas it is only the independent I, the inherently existent I. Again, the substantially existent I, the objectively existent I, all these things, that does not exist. And we can refute a level of misconception, but we never refute the mere I. The mere I exists. Because there is a danger here of stumbling into denial and nihilism, it is crucial as a first step to understand what is being negated in selflessness. All right? How does I appear to your mind? It does not appear to exist through the force of thought only. Rather, it appears to exist more concretely. You need to notice and identify this mode of apprehension. It is your target. So let me take it off screen here for just a moment. And His Holiness does give additional instruction about how do we bring that sense of an I up in an even more vivid way. Because if we just conceptualize about it, it becomes a little strange. When is it kind of more prevalent than other times? As I mentioned earlier, we can have moments where it doesn't seem that we're grasping so much to that. But if we have a delusion present, or even some level of fear or apprehension present, that sense of an I is going to be really stark and vivid in our mind. It's going to be something that we can notice much more easily. So it's not to say that it isn't present at other times, but it is most noticeable when we have something that's going on in our lives that is a source of some sort of consternation, some sort of increase in our awareness. The example that's often used is if you're falsely accused. If somebody says, you know, I think you took my blah, 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 blah. You took my tablet, you took my phone, you took my this, my that. And we didn't do it, right? At that moment of like feeling falsely accused and the strong sense of an I that's like, no, I didn't. I didn't take anything of yours, right? It seems to be much more kind of pronounced at that time, right? That's what we want to bring up, not go back and relive that whole scenario when somebody falsely accused you or whatever, or even in more positive times when we've had a mind that's full of pride. There's always that strong sense of an I that's present then too. His Holiness even goes into a number of examples so you can kind of work with it and try to bring up that strong sense of an I. As I said, it doesn't mean that it's not present at other times. It's just not as noticeable, perhaps. And we need to really have that strong, grasping mind kind of present as what kind of give us an idea of that target, what it is that is being held to so strongly at that time as existing. This strong sense of an I that is self-established, that is existing again on its own. All right, we'll look at again that in a moment when we get to the meditation. Second step. Okay, if this sense of an I exists, he says here, the second step is to determine that if that's so, and it exists in the way that it seems to be or appears to be, it must be either one with mind and body or separate from mind and body. Let's look at this reasoning a little bit more. If I say that any phenomenon is either a computer or not a computer, is there a third possibility? If it's a phenomenon, if it exists, it's either a computer or not a computer. So anything that isn't a computer, we can say, an apple, a chair, a person, all of those are not computers, right? They fit into the second category, not a computer. So this is a similar thing. We either say it's the same as a computer or different from a computer. Is there a third possibility of something that is neither of those? Anyone? I mean, make some sense, right? It's either, we can even use this with, like I can say, here at Thupten Norbaling, at the Buddhist center here, or not here. Everyone is either here or not here, right? And the people who are here are here. The people who are not here are not here. Those are the two possibilities. There's not a third category of people who are somewhere else, because not here includes everybody wherever they're at, anyone who is not in the Gompa here, right? All right. So this is what we have to do with this second step is we have to say, okay, if this real I exists in the way that it appears, and that was what we brought up in the first step, if it exists in that way, I should be able to find something that is either identical to the same as, in the same room as this stuff that is sitting on the chair or cushion right here, this mind and body complex, or it should be completely different than that. Now, again, we've kind of already refuted something completely different than that with that first type of I that we refuted, right? Because that whole concept of something being utterly different, completely, totally different than the mind and body that is still the I, doesn't seem like it's, you know, a viable option, right? Again, remember last week I did talk about how the label I and the basis are two different phenomena, but they're interrelated, right? You know, they're never completely, utterly independent. Here we're talking about something that is completely not the mind and body and not related to the mind and body, completely apart from them. Something that we can find that is the I that exists over there with the mind and body existing elsewhere. We just simply don't find anything. That's what we're going to get into. But these are the two possibilities. Step 2 is saying, what are the possibilities for that to exist? Now, again, why is it findable? Once more, because we are adhering to something that seems to be self-established, seems to be here. Well, then we should be able to find it. The possibilities are, I'm going to find it together with all this stuff as something that is equivalent to a part of this stuff or the totality of this stuff, or I'm going to find it as something completely apart from this stuff. You might not think that second step is so important, but it's exhausting the possibilities. Because if the real I exists, it's either going to be here together with this mind and body or completely apart from the mind and body. There's no third possibility. And as part of this second step, you should get definite in your mind that those are the only two possibilities. Kind of, you know, and I guess if you use the key analogies, I've mentioned the keys that being in the drawer or the bowl or whatever that you put your keys in when you get home. If your keys are not in the bowl, then they're going to be somewhere other than the bowl, right? That's a big world that we're looking at as other than the bowl. They could be, you know, outside in the pathway coming into our wherever we live. They could be in the pocket of some thief who took the keys away from us, or you know, whatever. They could be many different places. But there's only two possibilities. Either the keys are in the bowl or they're not in the bowl. Is there a third possibility? No, because not in the bowl covers a whole lot of territory. All right. Again, important to have that clarity, though, so that we get to the right conclusion and we understand that if it doesn't exist in one or the other, then it doesn't exist at all. There's no third possibility. Okay. Then 3 and 4 are kind of the easy step. After ascertaining that there are no other possibilities, that we only had two, in the final two steps, you analyze to see first whether the I and the mind-body complex can be either one inherently established entity, that they're identical in some capacity, or they are different inherently established entities. Again, as I mentioned earlier, they are different. The I and the mind-body. The I is the label. The mind-body complex is the basis of labeling, but they are not inherently established, meaning established completely on their own side. They are interdependent, as we saw when we went through the reasoning of dependent arising. So this is kind of the steps that we go through in terms of understanding this emptiness. And let's take a look at it, because I did want to share that with you, because it is important if you're going to work with this meditation over the next week that you actually have an understanding of this way that it is done, because this is a very valuable way to do it. The first part of it, again, is reiterating those steps, identifying the person as it is misconceived by ignorance, deciding that if the person existed the way it is misconceived, it must be findable, either in relation to the body-mind complex or independently of this complex. Then third, proving that it's not findable the first way, and then fourth, proving it's not findable the second way, right? So the actual meditation, of course, that starts with doing some breathing meditation, settle the mind a bit so you can do a more focused meditation, especially on this topic of emptiness. The first step in the body of the meditation is to identify the object to be negated by this analysis. Bring to mind, this is Thupten Pende who put this meditation together, a really wonderful practitioner and scholar. Bring to mind thoughts of yourself. Include thoughts where you take yourself seriously. If someone called you a thief, how would you feel? If someone called you stupid, would you feel like an empty construct? Then he uses a kind of another example of a phenomenon that's not the I, such as if he said, if you saw US Treasury employees burn bales of retired old $20 bills, would you feel that great wealth was going up in smoke? Those pieces of paper are only $20 bills if the US Treasury designates them as such, right? Likewise, we are merely designated by thought, but there are occasions when we feel concrete. Try to remember or imagine such an occasion and bring to mind that strong sense of an identity that rears its head, particularly when we feel threatened or even in moments of great elation, where it seems like the I is so real, so vivid at that time. Then the next paragraph, once your identity, the sense of an I, appears, decide that if this exists concretely, then it must be findable in either of those two ways. That's the second step, determining the possibilities. Either it's findable within the body or mind or independently of the body or mind. Now, you do this the third step, which is begin to analyze for sameness, analyze for something that is identical to that strong sense of I in regard to the mind-body complex. Start with your body. Again, we worked with the body in the meditation on dependent arising last week. Here, what we're doing is we're trying to investigate the various elements of the body itself, to see if we find something that is equivalent to that I in all ways. If he says, is it the body? Are you your body? Is that the I? If not, check if it is a part of your body. Check from the top of your head to your toes. Ask the question, am I the same as this in every way? Let me take it off screen for a moment. So let's start with the body. Are you equivalent? Is this strong sense of an I identical to the body? Well, again, this body is a physical phenomenon, right? It's form. It's not, it's matter. It's not, doesn't have any mentality to it. But we have an experience of a mentality to our I, right? So if we found something that is identical to the real I, the sense of I that we are adhering to, that is simply the body, it would negate that there's any mentality to our I, right? Because it would only be a physicality. We would just be lumps of flesh that have all these various organs with no mental component at all, no consciousness. That cannot be the real I, right? Because it would belie our experience of the I having more than just a physicality. Let's go to any part of the body, you're going to run into the same consequences, right? Sometimes we do have a strong sense of an I, sometimes in our heart area, even in Tibetan Buddhism, they often point to this center of their chest as being themselves. Oh, this is me. But this strong sense of an I that we might adhere to as being our brain, being our heart, being, some part of our body, this also can be proven to be wrong. Because then we would only be that. If you were only your head or your brain, then anything other than that would not be you at all. Right? Because we're talking about something that is findable as being that essence, that real sense of I that we are looking for, that we identified in the first step. Cannot be any part of the body, but don't just give up after you do, oh, well, it's not the body because I'm the reasons I just gave. Do the investigation. See where you feel a strong sense of self. If you stub your toe, you feel a strong sense of an I down in your toe, right? Is your I in the toe? Is that your real I there? That real I that, again, you're adhering to so tightly that you identified in that first step. Exhaust the body completely as much as you can. I mean, you can go down to even deeper levels of individual organs and then parts of organs, like your stomach. Is it your stomach? Is it the entry into the stomach? Is it the exit out of the stomach? Is it any part of the stomach? Take the heart and pick it apart in terms of the auricles and the ventricles and the various parts of the body, of the heart. Anyway, you can keep doing this analysis. And you should get to the conclusion, if you've done it correctly, that there's nothing that is in your physical basis, your body, that is the real I. You haven't located it. Try the mind. Okay, well, let me go back to the meditation here. So we pull that up and work with this. So again, the conclusion and that paragraph there, it says, if you cannot find the body or any of its parts to be the same as yourself, then conclude, I'm not findable in the body. You know, this I that you're refuting, it's not just the mere I, it's this real I is not findable in the body. Remember, I mentioned that last week. That's how Rinpoche would always talk about the I that we're refuting, because it seems to be so real. It seems to have its own identity established from its own side. So then he says in the next paragraph, now analyze your mind. This is the other part of the mind body complex, right? Question, am I identical with my mind? Is this strong sense of an I findable as being equivalent to my mind? Is it identical with a part of my mind, such as my mental consciousness versus my sense consciousnesses? Is it my wisdom versus my ignorance? Is it my compassion versus my hatred? You know, pick your mind apart. There are many parts of your mind, many different mental factors, many different components of your mind. And we're not talking about the brain, as we've discussed many times in this whole discovering Buddhism thing. We're talking about mind, consciousness. Apply this analysis as described in the teachings, Pende says. When you are certain that you are not identical with the mind or a part of the mind, then conclude that you cannot be found in the mind. This real I is not equivalent to the mind. And if we do this analysis, there is a tendency to think that somehow this real I is the mind. Remember earlier tonight, I was talking about how those other groups that only refute the first two senses of a self of persons, they will hold that there's something that is the real I that goes from life to life. Most of them, again, identifying that continuity of consciousness, that thread of consciousness that ties all of our lives together, that that's the real I. But think about the consequences of that. If that is the real I, you are only that thread of consciousness. Well, then at any other grosser levels of consciousness you wouldn't be able to experience. Any physicality you would never identify as being yourself. Everything would be merely that thread of consciousness, not anything else. That's the problem we run into with any of these things when we start analyzing something that has at least two parts. By identifying with one of them, then you never would identify with the other. If your real I is the body, then you never have a mental component, as I said earlier. If your real I is the mind, then you never have a physical component to your sense of an I, which is belied by our experience, right? We don't have this thing that we're just minds, we're just consciousness. Of course, we see other consequences. This is something I'm going to look at shortly in terms of what His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins share. Pende goes on to talk about the combination of these two. He says, now, the bottom paragraph there, analyze if you are identical with the combination of your body and mind. Well, again, we call this the mind-body complex. Use examples to look for differences. For example, you can touch yourself by placing your finger on your arm, but is this the same as touching the combination of your body and mind? It isn't, is it, right? Again, when you stub your toe, you're feeling a strong sense of the I being your toe, but that is independent of the mind, right? When you are certain that you are not identical with the combination of your mind and body, determine that you are not findable in the body or the mind or the two of them combined. Of course, another way to look at this is that when you do have two things that are the basis for the I, and again, there are many more beyond that, because as we pointed out, there are many parts of the body, many parts of the mind. But if you are saying that it's the collection of this, well, then you're talking about a collection. You're not talking about a unitary phenomenon. What is a collection? A collection consists of at least two things, in this case, mind and body, but again, we can elaborate to have many more. So you are kind of thinking of a unitary sense of an I that is real on the basis of something that has manifold aspects, has physical components, mental components, and then within those, various other components. It's kind of right there in front of us that anything that we think of as a singular phenomenon, such as the I, that we are believing in, that we think is real and existing independently, cannot be equivalent to something that is two or more things. This is the consequences, again, that we're going to look at shortly. You can already see that it kind of unfolds when we begin to look at it logically. How could we find something that is unitary to be something that is multiple? You know, one and many cannot be equivalent. Just no way to make those two equivalent. Mine or I is simply a label being given to mind and body. All right, that's the third step. The paragraph there, the full paragraph at the top. Now analyze if you exist independently of your body or mind. Imagine removing all your attributes that are also attributes of your body and your mind. Remove the physicality of your body, kind of like set it aside. Take the mentality that you know of as your consciousness, set it aside. Then, when you look to see what's left, ask yourself if this is you. Well, there's nothing left, I don't think. You get rid of the body, you get rid of the mind. Is there some sort of remnant that's remaining? That's the I. This is, again, kind of similar to that sense of a permanent, partless, independent self that we talked about earlier that's much coarser. Is there something that can exist totally apart from the body and mind? Remove the body and mind, and there you are. It's some little I that exists independently of those two, completely different than those two. Again, that was the fourth step. So you should get to this place here where it says, determine that you are not findable independently of the body or mind. This is the conclusion we want to get to, that you do not exist because there is, I didn't mean it as completely. You do not exist inherently, intrinsically, independently. You exist still as a mere imputation, but you do not exist in the false way that you are adhering to yourself to exist. And then he gives a little more advice about working with this meditation. But the whole point of it is to get to that unfindability, to get to that place where you go, I can't find that real I here with this collection of stuff in any part of it, not even the complex of all of it together, the collection of this combination of body and mind, nor can I find it to be utterly different, completely independent. There are only two possibilities. That was what I determined when I got to the second step. Therefore, the I doesn't exist that way. The I is unfindable as an inherently existent phenomenon. And that should be, again, what you kind of focus on when you get to that point. Remember how I talked about, when we were talking about meditation, how we stabilize the mind initially, then we do the analysis, we do the analytical meditation. When we get to the conclusion, which we don't arrive at until we get to through all four steps, when you get to the place where you go, that I that I believe in so strongly, that I can see when it arises in these particular moments, when it's quite vivid and prominent, that I is unfindable to exist. I cannot find anything that is. I'm finding the not finding of that I. I'm not finding that I to exist. I'm left with its absence. That's its emptiness. The emptiness of the mere I is its lack of inherent existence. There is no self that's fabricated by our ignorance in the way that it is. That ignorance is grasping at something that is non-existent. Doesn't exist at all. We can find its non-existence. That's its emptiness. And let me go through quickly, and then we'll see if there are questions. The number of slides, but I think it'll be worthwhile. This is the conclusion again. Then, when you have realized that the I does not inherently exist, then it's easy to realize that what is mine does not inherently exist. Those things that are an extension of me as the owner of things, which again is very much how we get involved in a lot of our delusions, grasping and being attached to the things that we think are mine, rejecting those things that come into our lives that cause us to have anger and so on. So this is kind of I'm repeating the little analysis that is on these pages that is kind of the meditative contemplation. What do they call it? They give a title to it. The meditative reflection that is at the end of each of these steps, because they each have their own chapter. The first step, identifying the target. He has a number of ways of approaching this. He says, first, imagine that someone else criticizes you for something you actually have not done, pointing a finger at you and saying, you ruined my party, or you ruined, our project at work or whatever. Watch your reaction. How does the I appear to your mind when you're being accused of something, criticized for something? In what way are you apprehending it? Notice how that I seems to stand by itself, self-instituting, established by way of its own character. Again, this is what we're trying to do, is to negate this false sense of I. So we have to bring it to mind. This whole first step is identifying the target. So as it says in this next slide, in addition to that contemplation that I just went through, there are 5 additional reflections in how to see yourself as you really are that can be used instead to help identify that false sense of I that is to be negated. And why I'm bringing that up is because, again, certain things work for certain people. This idea of being falsely accused, some people have a really strong reaction when that happens, but other people may be like, I don't care if you falsely accuse me. I mean, it doesn't bother me. I'm not worried about my reputation or whatever. So if you look at what's on those pages, you see that there's example number 2. Remember a time when you were fed up with your mind, such as when you failed to remember something. Number 3, remember a time when you were fed up with your body or with some feature of your body, such as your hair. Number 4, remember a time when you did something awful and you thought, I really made a mess of things. Number 5, remember a time when you did something wonderful and you took great pride in it. Number 6, remember a time when something wonderful happened to you and you took great pleasure in it. He's pointing out all these various examples of times when we feel that I so prominent. We really believe in the inherent existence of that I because it appears so vivid at that time. When we have these experiences that are caught up in our ego and our identification with whatever is going on. So I'm just, you're welcome if you have this book, this wonderful book by His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins, to use the meditation there. There's even a very short form of the entire 4 steps at one point, but these are at the end of each of these chapters, kind of going through the individual steps. But it's important that there be some continuity, that we try to go through all 4 of these to get to the conclusion. Because only by getting to the conclusion will you have the penny drop, as Venerable Rabina often says, right? Okay, step 2. Second step, determining the choices. Analyze whether the I that is inherently self-established in the context of the mind-body complex could have a way of existing other than being part of or separate from mind and body. And it's either part of the mind and body or it's separate from. Again, those 2 conclusions, two ways. See, there's no third category of existence. They're either the same or different. And decide then that if the I inherently exists as it seems to, it must be either one with, the same as mind and body, or separate from mind and body. So we're going to analyze then in the next 2 steps that sameness or difference, separateness. The third step is analyzing oneness. Now, what His Holiness does here, and what Jeffrey happens to do, is they work with this idea of consequences. It's interesting, this school that we're studying, Prasangika Madhyamaka, this view of emptiness, it's usually translated as the consequence middle way school, because it's believed that you can actually get to a realization of emptiness by seeing the consequences of things existing in the way that you think they do. If things really did exist inherently, if this real I was one with the body or the mind or the combination of them, what are the consequences? I already hinted at that a little bit when we talked about the reasoning earlier. This is a very different way than the search. They're both worthwhile to do. The one we talked about earlier, that was Thupten Pende's analysis, you go looking for it, like you're a spy investigating to see, oh, is there anyone in here or not? Is that real I in the body? Is that real I in the mind? And you point it all out and you can't find anything that is it, so you come to the conclusion it's not in the mind-body complex. And then you do the second analysis and you get to that conclusion eventually that it doesn't exist at all. That's a really valuable way to kind of go through a kind of investigation of what can you find, what can't you find. This consequence thing is a little bit more of working with our reasoning mind. Now, if we come to that consequence of what we are believing in, then we come to see that what we are believing in doesn't make sense because of the absurd consequences that follow, the things that cannot hold water. So let's take a look at just a few of these. I don't know if I have time to go through all of them. And I would encourage you to work with these if you can. So consider the consequences if the I, this real I, is established in and of itself in accordance with how it appears to our minds, and if it is also the same as the mind body. That's the first one. We're analyzing for sameness or oneness. First, the first consequence. I and mind body would have to be utterly and in all ways one, right? You have to kind of find that oneness that doesn't make any sense, right? Because if it's completely one thing, then it won't ever be the other, as I pointed out. In that case, even asserting an I would be pointless. If the mind body complex is already the I, it's the inherently existent I, well, then why do you need to call it I? It's already I. Mind body complex is already I. The third one, it would be impossible to think of my body or my head or my mind. Why? Because you are inherently the body and mind. So you would never have a possessor of any of those things. Fourth, when mind and body no longer exist, the self would also not exist. Of course, the self is an imputation that carries on. When we have our coarser mind that's with this body, and those no longer exist, the self would die with those. But the self is not those. If it was equivalent to those, then it would die along with the mind body when we get to the end of this life. Fifth, since mind and body are plural, this is the one I pointed out earlier, one person's selves also would be plural. I'd have the I that is the mind and the I that is the body. So, for some people, these consequences are probably falling flat, and you kind of look at it and go, well, I don't really get it. It's not really working for me. That's okay. Work with the other analysis. Do the investigation to see if you really find the real I in the body, in the mind. But these consequences are meant to help us to get to this place of understanding that what we're adhering to doesn't make sense. The alternative to that, number 5, was if you have plural in terms of the basis, then the I's must be plural. The other one, number 6, is if the I is just one, that's the feeling we have, right? That there's one singular I here. Well, then mind and body would have to be one. And we know that that's absurd. Your mind and body are two different phenomena. One is consciousness, the other is matter. They are not equivalent. Then you consider the consequences if the I is established in and of itself in accordance with how it appears to our minds, and if it is also inherently different from mind body. That's the 4th step, right? I and mind body would have to be completely separate. It would have to be utterly different and no crossover whatsoever. Oops. Then, what did I do there? In that case, I would have to be findable after clearing away the mind and body. So again, we had that idea of if you mentally think about, I'm going to isolate mind and body, and then I'm going to see if there's something else that is the I, that is totally independent and apart from that, totally different, totally separate. The I also would not have the characteristics of production, abiding, and disintegration that are going on with the body, which is absurd. Why? Because it's utterly different than the mind and body. And these maybe take a little more explanation than what I have time for. But I also would be absurdly a figment of our imagination, or perhaps even permanent in the midst of something that is impermanent, our mind and body. And fifth, absurdly, the I would not have any physical or mental characteristics. This is an interesting one. Like if we say the I is completely, utterly different than the mind and body, then it has no connection with any sort of physical or mental characteristics that the mind and the body have. Because those are what the mind and the body experience. The I is experiencing something totally different. Again, that one is kind of easy for us to get, as I pointed out earlier, because to identify something that is totally separate, completely independent of the mind and body, doesn't hold ground, right? Because we don't have a sense. I don't have a sense that I'm in the other room of the center here. My body and mind are here, so this is where I have the sense of an I. So again, that one gets to be easier to prove it. I encourage you, again, I'm not going through the full commentary that His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins give on each of these consequences, but I would encourage you to take a look at them. I do want to share with you this part, though, while I've got just a couple minutes, the coming to a conclusion. He says, once you engage in analyzing in this way, you will begin to question the strong sense of a self-instituting I that earlier seemed to exist so palpably. You will gradually start to, aha, previously this seemed to be so true, but maybe it really isn't. I mean, this is the goal, is we want to get to that place where we start questioning what we have believed in about ourselves since beginningless time. Then, as you analyze more and more, you will become convinced, not just superficially, but from the depths, that such an I does not exist at all. You will pass beyond mere words and gain conviction that though it appears concretely, it does not exist in that way. Remember, just like the dream objects that don't exist as real objects. This is the imprint of extended analysis, a decision from within your own mind that this sort of I really does not exist. Okay? I think that's, well, this one here. By meditating and gradually cultivating these four steps, you will develop an ability to examine anything and everything this way, seeing the conflict between appearance and reality and deciding from the depths that persons and things do not exist the way they appear. Okay. I think that's probably good enough for tonight. I'd want to leave a little time for questions. Because that's the whole thing. When we get to this understanding of the I, because this same analysis can be used for other things. I could analyze the book in the same way. How does the book appear? It appears to have its own bookness out here. That's the object of negation, that real book that seems to be from the side of this basis I'm holding in my hand. Where is the real book? Well, it's either going to be equivalent to something that is in my hand, this basis, the cover, the pages, whatever, or it's going to be completely different. And I can come to the same conclusion by investigating that there can't be this unitary book on the basis of something that has many different parts, and nor can a unitary book in this concrete way exist completely independent of those parts. Everything can be analyzed in a similar way, but we use this primarily, initially at least, for analyzing the I. Then we can turn that same reasoning to any phenomenon and come to understand that things do not exist in that real way that we are falsely adhering to them or adhering to them in that fictitious manner. That was a lot of words tonight. Any questions, comments? No. It's a lot. I know. I mean, we're kind of trying to get our heads around this analysis. Hopefully, some of you have done this analysis before and already begun to see how effective it is at getting you to this place of not finding. As I said, once you get to that place, try to focus in on that. Make that your object to stabilize on, is the not finding, the emptiness, the lack of inherent existence. If you see yourself falling into a nihilistic bent, then as His Holiness advised that I mentioned last week, go back to dependent arising and say, yeah, but things still do exist. There still is an I. There still is, this, that, whatever, all the various phenomena. They just don't exist inherently. Okay, Bill has a question here, I believe. Yeah.
I'm just curious as to whether, can you define ego in relation to what we've been talking about?
Yeah, we use this term ego, and Lama Yeshe was really fond of the term when he learned about it. I mean, we have to be careful to not make everything absolutely equivalent, though, because ego is a term that came out of Western psychology. But nonetheless, there is a component of ego, as I understand it. I'm not a well-versed at all in Western psychology as much as Buddhist psychology, but I think we can say there's some component of it that is similar. But Freud wasn't out to identify the object of negation and go through this analysis in the way that we are doing it. So I would be hesitant to make it an equivalent term. But nonetheless, many teachers, and again, Lama Yeshe was frequently using ego, as equivalent to this false sense of an I. So I don't know if I can say more than that because, again, not being that trained in Western psychology, I'm afraid I would probably muck it up somewhere along the line and someone would have to come back and correct me. But perhaps this is, again, something that those who are better versed in Western psychology could do an analysis of and see the differences versus the similarities between what we're calling a false sense of an I and what Freud called the ego. We don't go into Buddhism like the superego and all this other, the I don't know, all these various terms that I just have heard about that, again, I don't have a good grasp on. Were you going to say something more, Bill? Yeah.
Well, I was thinking about it and it just struck me that I was thinking that ego was most manifest when you were strongly grasping one.
Mm-hmm.
So you got stuff chatting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Just
Egoistic, yeah. And in that way, we would say that that's definitely equivalent, but I don't know if that was the totality of how Freud defined ego. I mean, again, I just am not well versed in all of that. That's why I tend to shy away from it to some degree. I think I used it once tonight, but I don't think that, in my estimation, again, from what little I know, that you can make these huge kind of this term from Western psychology that Freud was identifying and this misconception that Buddha says that we all have. Are they identical in all ways? I don't know. I'm hard pressed to do that.
One last question. I'm wondering what, for example, His Holiness Dalai Lama might say about those people that have had out-of-body experiences or near-death experiences where they felt this eye was hovering, looking down on the sea and so on.
Mm-hmm.
What do you, is that all within the realm of just being a mental construct?
Well, there's still consciousness at that point. I mean, because regardless of what's going on with the body, and I mean, they do have people who recount experiences where the consciousness seems to be in a space above while the body is on the table or wherever, the ground where the death has occurred in, not still near death, not complete death. So there still seems to be kind of a basis for what we are positing as an I. So there can still be an I imputed to that basis of the mind that is separate from the body at that stage. And of course, this is what Buddhism holds, is that the I, the consciousness, not the I, the consciousness does separate from the body at death. And there still is a sense of an individual there that is the I that goes through that process and then becomes an intermediate state being that has a subtler body and then eventually becomes the being of their next life and da 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 da. There's always a strong kind of identification of that as being an I in a merely imputed manner. But there can also be, of course, moments where we are imputing more than that, thinking that there's a real I there. But again, there's nothing that gets contradictory around those experiences of consciousness seeming to observe something that from another vantage point or whatever. I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question completely, but yeah. Well, we should probably conclude. If you still have questions, once more, you've got my email address. Please write to me with your questions. I'm happy to entertain them that way, or if there's something that really needs to be answered in the larger group. I'm going to continue and review this a little bit when we resume next week. But if you can work with the meditation, again, especially the one that we went through, because I wanted to do that just to point out the way that that one works with the investigating. And then if you have time to go back to His Holiness's book, or the slides that you'll be sent, and work with the detail of how to do the investigation according to these consequences. If they, again, make some sense to you, you might read more of how His Holiness and Jeffrey Hopkins talk about those, but I think they're well worth investigating. There is a question in the thing, are the virtual attendees here or not there or something else? Well, I would say physically, if we're talking about where beings are located, they're not here. They would be. So again, if we go back to that determining the possibilities, we have one possibility of they are here in the Gompa. People are either here in the Gompa or people are not in the Gompa. Well, then where is that person? There's a screen image of that person that's on the computer here and it's on the screens in the Gompa at times, but that's not you. I mean, that you identify as you. You think of you as the mind and body and relate to yourself in that context. So it would be, again, that would be not there or not here. There's here in the Gompa and not here. What about the viewers on YouTube in the future? They would still be not here, I guess, in this moment. Because again, we're talking about if it's somebody who is here in the room and they're going to watch it in the future, I guess they would be included in being here. Because when we talk about this as being the example for the second step of determining the possibilities, it's just to give a flavor for that. That when we talk about anything, we can say it's either this or not this. And that becomes what we call, I didn't mention the term tonight, a dichotomy. There's nothing that is either this or not this. It's either a computer or not a computer, either in the Gompa or not in the Gompa. A kind of only two possibilities. And those are the only two possibilities we can find. Something that exists would have to be one or the other. So I hope that answers. But it feels like you're here. Well, that's good, Deb. I'm glad you're having that experience. Sometimes I feel like when I'm doing just a Zoom conference with people that it feels like I'm with other people more than it does sometimes when I'm in a room like this and you're all on a screen in front of me. So I don't know. I think we can have that illusion or that feeling. So I'm glad you're having that experience. Let's do our prayers so we can conclude things tonight, because I know some of you have many of you, or if not all of you, have things that you need to do, perhaps even go to bed. Let's recite the prayer on the screen. Due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all living beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that has not arisen arise and grow, and may that which has arisen not diminish, but increase more and more. Let me take it off screen and let's just do the general prayer for our precious teachers, making dedication for the good health and long lives and the fulfillment of all the holy wishes of His Holiness the Dalai Lama and all the other gurus that we and others have. Also, we dedicate for the swift return of Kabji Zopa Rinpoche, our precious spiritual director. And lastly, we dedicate for all the beings that we're holding in our hearts at this moment, whatever their suffering is, whatever they're experiencing, through the force of what we've done here tonight, may these beings find freedom from that and find all the causes and conditions that will lead them to perfect happiness. And may this be so for not just those that we're thinking of right now, but for all beings. All right, thank you all very much. Sorry I went a bit over again tonight. Thank you for hanging in there, and I'll see you next Monday. Be well.